cleared the tower. Every 4 computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.
How's everyone doing today? Today we are going to be welcoming a special guest back, Susan Trimbath, for a part two continuation to what she did. And Dr. Trimbath, I am so excited to have you back on our podcast. Like, it is just phenomenal. I've probably listened to the last one a couple times just to try to absorb what you've actually said to us, and so that I could bring more to today. So hopefully I am going to be sitting back again and kind of listening and kind of taking notes so that whenever people do have questions of what you go over, I can um, answer it a little bit more elegantly than I've been able to the last couple weeks. Um, so I do want to thank you again for being a part of this, and everyone on YouTube, welcome, and sit back, enjoy it. She is a wealth of information. And with that, I am going to hand it off to Lady and to get us started.
Hi guys, I'm so glad to have Dr. Trimbath back. We really appreciate it. So just to remind everybody, we do have a part one. The first interview took place on June 22nd. So if you want to go back and watch that first interview, we encourage you to do so. We are going to pick up right where we left off and continuing with our questions. And again, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Trimbath.
You're very welcome, and I'm very happy to have been invited to come back and continue with the questions. Seems like there's never enough time to answer all the questions. So I know a lot of things come up for people, and also Kenna, if questions came up based on the last one, I'm happy to clarify those things for you as well.
Wonderful, thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate. I might send that list over to you.
So I guess we're going to go ahead and kick it off with the Indian dude. He's going to take us on covering account types.
Thank you, Lady. Dr. Trimbath, welcome back. Thank you for your time today. Just to piggyback off of our conversation last time, we were talking about just the general investor things that we need to know. Couple of questions that came about was on the account types. One was around margin accounts. And post margin accounts, there's a couple of questions around the financial institutions, reliability. Is it big banks versus credit unions? What's better? And the difference between 401k versus IRA. So let's start with the first part, margin accounts. What do you think about margin accounts? What would you sort of say is the best way to approach a margin account? Second part is around whether big banks, major financial institutions are better equipped than credit unions, and the main difference between 401k and IRA, and what is your recommendation on 401k and IRAs?
Right. So thanks for these. These are really terrific questions, and it's the kind of questions that I can't really answer on Twitter. People have written whole books about these things, so this format is so much better to try to get information across. So margin accounts, the only time you need a margin account is if you want to trade on credit. So if that's not your intention to trade on credit, to trade in derivatives, if you're more of a bread and butter type of trader, buy and hold, that sort of thing, you just want to stick with stocks, maybe some bonds, maybe some munis or something, then you don't need a margin account. And there are some conflicts that can come up between you and the broker once you have a margin account. But if you need it, then then that's because you want to trade on credit, right? You can leverage your money. So you put up 25%, I don't know, these are all contract-based accounts. So your agreement, your account that you have with a broker is based on a contract that you signed, the account agreement. So they can be different from one firm to the next firm. Different types of accounts within the same firm could all have different, different rights and obligations. So you want to be careful about that. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to read those agreements. I know they're boring. I know they're, you feel like, well, I just want to scroll down, hit accept, and then move on with my investing. And everybody does that for everything. I do it every time, Zoom or Google or anybody changes their terms of service, I just, I sort of scroll through it, click it, and go on because I know I'm going to use the service anyway. When it comes to banks and brokerage accounts where your investment money is involved, you really do need to read it. And even if you don't read it at the minute that you're signing up, you can go back and download it and read it carefully. Just be sure that you're getting what you want, right? So if you want a margin account, you want to trade on leverage, right? You want to put 25% up and be able to trade 100% of the value, or you want to do derivatives where you have to have accounts that allow margin, then that's one thing. Short sellers require margin accounts because if you want to sell securities short, stocks or bonds, then you need a margin account because you have to put up some part of the money to cover the stock loans, the short sell fees, etc. So are they too risky? Go back to the first part of our last discussion, risk reward profile. How much risk are you willing to tolerate? Knowing that the more risk you take, the more reward you get, the higher your rates of return. Conversely is also true, the higher the rate of return, generally speaking, the more risk you're taking. And you have to, once you know where you are on that spectrum, then that's where, you decide if you want to do that. As far as what I use, a bank or a credit unions certainly pay higher rates of return than regular banks, right? So if I have CDs, savings account, even interest on checking, if I'm with a credit union, I'm getting a better rate of return there than I am at the bank, because the credit unions are run like, most of them are run like cooperatives. So Navy Federal, for example, is run as a cooperative. So however much, so they don't actually call it paying you interest, they're paying you dividends. So when you put your money into a bank, like a Wells Fargo, a national bank or an international bank, they're going to use those funds, because we have fractional reserve accounting where part of it is set aside and the rest of it can be used to make loans and other investments. So they're going to invest that money, make loans and business loans and mortgage loans and small business loans and car loans, et cetera, pretty much anywhere around the world. Whereas with a credit union, you're more likely to know where that money's being loaned. So that money's being loaned to local businesses, to local home buyers, car purchases, et cetera. So there's this, have any of you heard of locavore? Where you just eat, you don't eat food that was grown more than 50 miles away from where you are?
I have, yeah.
Right.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, locavore. So there's this book by Amy Cortese in 2011 called Locavesting, right? You can go to locavesting.com, in fact, and they have a whole website set up for it. But it basically says that, well, the subtitle is The Revolution in Local Investing and How to Profit from It. So if you put your money with a local credit union, then that money is going to be loaned and invested locally, as opposed to, Citigroup. It could be anywhere in the world. And so there's this idea that if you only eat food that's grown locally, right? So if you only eat food that's grown within 50 miles of where you live, and most farmers markets have a rule that food has to have been harvested within 50 miles of that location where it's sold, then why wouldn't you do the same thing with your money? Because yes, you can make a profit by investing in some company on the other side of the world, but if you invest in a local company, right, then you're going to see impact on that in your community, where you live, where your kids go to school, where you work, right, where you play. That comes back to you a lot faster. Those we call them, in economics, we call them externalities. They're not part of your investment model, but they come to you all the same as a result of doing local investing. So this locavesting is one idea. And the other one is Slow Money. That's slowmoney.org. That's a nonprofit. Slow Money is also about investing locally. Now, their focus right now is on making 0% loans to organic farms, right? But whatever state, they're only in 17 states, they're not nationwide, but because again, the idea is local. So Slow Money is like local vesting in the sense that you want to keep those things keep those investments near you. So that's an advantage of a credit union over a bank. Is one safer than the other? Both of them are insured. They have different insurance groups. So I think we talked about this a little bit the last time. You have SIPC, which is insurance for money in your brokerage account. You have FDIC, which is for money in your bank account. And then there's another one, I can't think of the name offhand, that insures money in your credit union account. So all of those have.
There's NCUA, right? The National Credit Union Association, that's basically backing all the credit unions. So that's the other big piece, right? That you're sort of talking about, that's insured.
Okay, so they all provide something like, it used to be $100,000 per account. Then last financial crisis, they bumped it to $250,000. I don't know if it's changed.
It's
periodically.
It's
But if you're worried about having more than $250,000 sitting in your checking account, you have bigger problems than whether or not that bank folds, because you basically have money sitting on the sidelines doing nothing, right? It's not earning, it might earn some pittance of interest, but it's not invested, it's not building, it's not, right? It's just idle. So anyway, that's an aside. So those all have that insurance in them. In that sense, they're the same. They all have pretty much the kind of the same level of regulation, like regulatory oversight. Although your banks, your commercial banks actually have a little more, because the states have banking departments that monitor banks, go out and examine banks. You have state bank examiners. And then the Federal Reserve goes in to examine the bank, and then the FDIC will come in. So they have more. So banks tend to have a little bit more. Not that it's, not that regulation, as we have seen, guarantees safety by any means, but certainly they have that. Other than that, I don't think that you should be worried about one or the other, right? If we could just, at this point, since we're talking about accounts, just talk briefly, if you don't mind, about the direct purchase plans. I was getting some questions on Twitter about that.
Yep, I was going to mention that as well. Sure.
Oh, you were? Okay, great. So through the 1980s, pretty much, there were programs there were always employee stock ownership programs, ESOP, employee stock ownership programs, where the idea was to try to bring the employees and the management closer to more properly align the goals of employees and management with shareholders, right? So that you don't, slack off at work, and you don't, take more perks than you should, those sort of things, just to try to align their purposes. So after employee stock ownership programs, when people left a company, some of them wanted to continue having their holdings. So then there was dividend reinvestment programs, DRIP, dividend reinvestment programs, so that you could leave your shares with the company, and they would, rather than write a check and send you a check for your dividends, they would use your dividend to buy more shares for you. And that really set up the mechanism that allowed these direct purchase plans to proliferate and grow. Because what it meant was that you would leave your share with the company, right? So the company holds your share for you electronically, probably. And then they add your dividend. They take your dividend and my dividend and Lady's dividend and Kenna's dividend. They take all these dividends together, and they would go to the market and make one big purchase for shares, and then add that to the program. And each person would get their, whatever your dividend was, you get that number of shares, including fractional shares, which in the 80s you couldn't really do with brokers. They really didn't deal with fractional shares. So that became the direct purchase plans. And then when I was at DTC in the mid to late 80s, or the late 80s, early 90s, I worked with the transfer agents to develop a program that would allow me to give an instruction to my broker to take shares out of CD & Co's name and have them transferred to my name and held at the company, right? And I could get a check for my dividends, or I could have my dividends reinvested. So they separated the dividend reinvestment program from the direct purchase program, right? So through the late 80s, they were pretty much tied together if you had one of these book entry accounts with the company. then for your shareholdings, then you pretty much had to reinvest your dividend. Now that's been separated. And they've also set up so the whole thing can be done electronically. So this is the key point that I want to make here is that the direct purchase plans are book entry accounts at the company for shares registered in the investor's name. But the plans are offered, so the plan is offered by the company, but the services are provided by the transfer agent. And that transfer agent is under contract to the company. So you have transfer agents like Computer Shares, big one, American Stock Transfer, Transfer Online. There are lots of them who offer this, but it's the company who designs it. So even at one transfer agent, they might have, I don't know, Computer Share has thousands of companies that offer these programs. And if you go through some of them, click through some of them, you'll see that the cost to buy a share, sell a share, open an account, close an account, they're different for every company. That's because, again, it's a contract. It's a contract between the company and the transfer agent that says, offer this service to my shareholders. So that's why the fees are different. There's no sort of flat rate on how to do it. And there's no one way to do it. My suggestion is that if you're interested in the company, is to go to that company's corporate website, look under investor relations and see if they offer it through their transfer agent. You could start at the transfer agent and go through all the companies they have. That's one way, of course, but they have thousands. So sometimes that list can be long. So every plan can be different. Because every company designs it the way they want. Companies who, I've been in these direct purchase plans since, I don't know, 1980 something, I don't know, before 1990, let's say. And when I first started, it was free to buy shares, but they would charge you $5 to sell any shares. One share or all your shares, didn't matter, they would charge you to sell. Because what happens is when you invest in those plans, your money goes directly to the company, right? The company pays a transfer agent, they pay some broker fees, they pay some banking fees, whatever, but the money goes straight to them. So companies were using this to build capital. Whereas if you buy the shares of a company on the open market, New York Stock Exchange, over the counter, whatever it is, that money is, the company never sees any of that money. That money's between you and the broker, between the buyer and the seller. That's where all the money, so that's the secondary market. So this was a way for companies to be able to encourage shareholders to buy and hold their shares of the company, become, sort of partners with the company. And then also for them to be able to raise this capital at a lower cost than if they had to do a public offering. So that kind of fits in there. And then 401ks, IRAs, some of the companies that offer direct purchase plans will let you set it up as an IRA or 401k. No, well, let's just say IRA for a minute. So the difference between a 401k and an IRA. A 401k is usually sponsored by a company. 401k is the section of the Internal Revenue Service Code that says that if you put money into a retirement plan and you don't have to pay taxes on it now, right? You earn it today, you put it into one of these retirement plans, and you don't have to pay taxes on it till you take it out. The idea being that when you're whatever retirement age you plan to be at, you'll have a lower income, right? Your annual income will be lower, so your tax rate will be lower. Lots of ifs and ands and buts in that little scenario, but generally speaking, that's why they were there. So 401k, just the section of the code. I worked for, when I worked for not-for-profits, it was a 401b. When I worked for college institutions, it was a 401 something or other. I think theirs might even be like a 402. So that's what a 401k is. It's usually set up by a company. If you have an LLC or a sole proprietorship, check with an accountant, a CPA, but there are rules in the IRS rules that would allow you to set up a sole proprietor 401k for one person. But that money is money that's not taxed now. It's taxed when you take it out. You also don't pay tax on the earnings. If it earns interest or capital gains, whatever, all that you pay ordinary income tax at the end. An IRA is an individual retirement account. So that's just you, one person, right? You don't have to have a company behind you. These IRAs came in the 80s, somewhere in the 80s. I think might have been the 1986 Tax Reform Act. Because what happened was at that time, they're starting to see that Social Security may or may not have as much money as it needs to have by the time the baby boomers, because the population has such a surge at that point in time. When that surge hit 65 or 72 and started to retire, Social Security would be a drain on Social Security to try to pay them all the money that they were promised. And so the government wanted a way to encourage people to save additional money for their retirement years. And so the individual retirement account, IRA, was developed. And those, again, you can put, now there's a limit on how much you can put in. There's a limit on how much you can put in any of these, and that depends on what your income is and your age. So an IRA is, I don't know, I think they started out at 2,000. I think it's a little bit higher than that now per year of money that you can put in there that you don't have to pay taxes on. So that's no taxes when the year that you earned it. You pay taxes when you take it out. And then once you reach 55, then they do what they call catch up. When we talked about this life cycle investing in our last session, life cycle investing being that your peak earning years are probably somewhere between 30 and 60, 30 and 60 are your peak earning years. So by the time you hit 55, if life happens. You're in your 20s, you're not making much money, you're in your 30s, you're starting to make some money, but then you have to get a car and you want a house and you have a family. And so you can, and then by the time you're in your 40s, then you're sending your kids to college, right? You see how, so you didn't have time to put all the savings away. So when you hit 55, they say you can do catch up, which means you can kind of double. So if it was 2,000, it's okay, once you hit 55, you do 4,000. So you can put more money in there. And this again goes back to that original discussion we had about life cycle investing. So you need to know where you are on that spectrum as to whether you would do one or the other. I would basically say whether it's 401k at your employer, they have all these different account numbers. If you're working for yourself, you want to look at Roth IRAs and Keogh plans and things like that. Anytime you can defer taxes on income it's a good idea. And also you just want to make sure that you're putting money away for when the time comes that you either can't work or don't want to work, right? So I just say, like I said, just do it, right? Once you hit 50, around age 50, Social Security Administration will grandfather you into any changes, like when they raise the minimum retirement age. I think when I first started working, it was like 59 when I first started working, and by the time I retired, it was 67, right? But by the time I hit 55, then I was grandfathered in, and now it's over. I think it's pushing 70 or just over 70 now to take full Social Security benefits. I was grandfathered in at an earlier age, right? So before you hit 50, you just want to make sure that you're saving as much as you can, because you don't know what's going to come, for the other benefits. So yeah, whatever version you decide works best for you. And again, I can't tell you how many times I started out in my 20s, because my parents would even, say, oh, if you put $2,000 a year into an IRA every year from now until you're ready to retire, you'll have $1 million when you retire. But $2,000 is a lot of money when you're 24. And I can't tell you how many times I would just wipe out all of the IRAs and all the savings plans, all the retirement money to finish my education, because I wanted to buy a house, and just go ahead and pay the extra taxes on it and just take it out. There's a tax penalty if you take it out before you retire. But so again, figure out where you are personally in that life cycle investing, and then make that commitment, that decision. And even if you have to dip into it later, it's still money that you saved and didn't spend in this time period.
That was a lot of amazing information. Like, I have so many notes over here. Like, it's awesome to hear it exactly.
So it was a lot. I kind of went on there, but there was sort of 3 questions built into one. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the intention was for us listeners and I would say financial literacy still thrill seekers to really understand um, how your life has been with your experiences and what you can sort of give us from an overall financial literacy perspective that we're all kind of seeking here. You had a multitude of points around financial institutions versus credit unions.
right.
Personally, for me and some of our in our group, we have always been saying credit unions are a better way to go. So I felt it was good to sort of have both sides from what you were saying. At this time, I'd like to actually kind of hand it off to Citadel Air to talk a little bit about overall market oversight and just the protection of retail, because ultimately all of this is us retail people, right? We're trying to get answers at this point.
Indeed. Good afternoon, Dr. Trimbath. How are you?
Hi, I'm just fine. Just fine. Thank you.
Brilliant. It's good to speak to you again. So as Indian mentioned, my questions pertain to protecting retail and conversely, protecting actual company rights as well. So I was going to touch a little bit on regulating bodies, market transparency, and some red flags that retail investors can look for. To start, who are the regulating bodies who monitor, the markets, securities, inefficiencies, and in what way do they keep their the institutions that are too big to fail, per se, in check? In your opinion?
Yeah, I wish I could say that they do keep them in check. I'm not optimistic on this point. That was the 2015, I did a book called Lessons Not Learned, where I kind of went through step by step of what we should be doing. They're kind of 4 tasks and 5 rules that should be in place that we've known, like all academic research on financial institutions globally has told us are things we should be doing. And for each one, I can point out why it was there and what's a theory and how it's supposed to protect it and how was it meant to work, and then tell you exactly how it wasn't done. We just didn't undertake the enforcement of rules, for example, having the regulations keep up with the new products that come out. Our federal government barely keeps up with the fact that, they're all using cell phones, but yet they didn't really have all the rules in place for cell phones, right? So it's kind of the same thing here. So as far as who regulates, I talked about this with the banks, the Federal Reserve Bank, the states, right? The FDIC insures bank deposits, SIPC, Securities Insurance Protection Corporation, something like that. They protect the brokers. The banks and brokers and the credit unions, they pay an insurance premium to these institutions on an annual basis based on the value of the assets that they're holding, the deposits that they're holding for their customers. And then that money, is used to insure your deposits to a limit. So always watch out for that. If you get to a point where, let's say, if you're using one financial institution, you have, checking, savings, certificates of deposit, other types of activity with them, you kind of want to watch that balance as it grows. Brokers are monitored by FINRA, I think, is there. It used to be NASDAQ, but now it's FINRA, and the SEC. So the SEC doesn't really look at banks except when they start to get involved with securities, which is in and out of fashion, right? So there was a period of time where banks were not allowed to be brokers, and then all the brokers became banks, and then the brokers gave up their bank status. So that's a fairly fluid situation. Whatever institution you use, you want to find out as much as you can about them. I'd rather know the devil that, the devil versus the one you don't. So even if I know something bad about my financial institution, at least I know what to watch out for. The Federal Reserve, FINRA, Securities and Exchange Commission, these are all public institutions that you can go to your state securities regulator website and find the whatever state, there's a State Department that looks at brokers to make sure that they're not doing bad things. There's a federal agency, right, the SEC that does that. There's FINRA that does that. Lots of places to investigate the credibility of the institutions you're working with. And then, so when Dodd-Frank was passed after the 2008 financial crisis, there were simply like so the too big to fail status was de facto, right? It was just like, if you got big enough, the government was going to step in and bail you out. That 2015 book, I have a whole list in there of, going back to the 70s and Penn.
I was just going to ask you that question, right? I mean, it seems to be that nothing is changing. The too big to fail mentality is just part of the grain of this financial system.
Yeah.
Is it possible at any point that we can break away, tear the woven stitches? Like, it seems to be they just band-aid it, or it's not even possible for us to get away from being too big. Some of these institutions have been in there for so many years that they're always going to have a backdoor.
Yeah, it's wow, that's just a huge question. Is it possible to change it? Yes, it absolutely is, because we know these things that need to be done. There's decades of research gone into what works and what doesn't work for regulating, governing, enforcing rules on financial institutions. That's all there, right? So we do know what needs to be done. My view is that the political will does not exist to get it done, right? So that's really that's the thing. So if we would need our, I don't mean to be such a downer, but I thought
you feel free to speak your mind. This is an very open-minded community that we have, so feel free.
Absolutely no. If I have to hold something back, you won't even know it's there, right? No, I don't. I'm not. And I've said this before too, like some of the biggest names in the industry have come after me in the past and not stopped me. So like, I'm not holding back for that. What I'm holding back is I don't want to be such a downer all the time, but this is a very, look, you would think that the regulators would, make sure that, companies that do bad things don't continue doing bad things, right? That there's some punishment in line. In economics, we call it the idea is that if there are no consequences for bad behavior, then why not keep behaving badly, right? Right. So you have this. So
exactly. Yeah.
Right. So if you don't have this, sorry, I was just trying to look for the list. I have this list in the other book of all the, like, I can go back to the 70s and show you where every time, like, there's always some reason why the government wants to bail out some bank, some airline, some industry. We bailed out the auto industry. We bailed out the airline industries. I mean, so what happens is all of the industries, including finance, and they're the big one, mm-hmm. they all come to learn that there's no consequence for bad behavior. There's no consequence for taking more risk than you can afford. There's no consequence for losing money year after year. There's no consequence for taking these absurd risks.
Right. We've actually talked about that quite a bit. Like the biggest one I talk about in our community is 1987 with Greenspan. Like that was probably the biggest, shot in the foot that we could have done, when he was just like, you know what? The banks don't fail, period. Like, and that to me was the biggest part of history, in recent history, I should say, that there would be no consequences for their actions in that sense. And in my opinion, I would love to hear your take on it.
No, and you're absolutely right. And what you're doing is what most people do, and that's in my lifetime. How many times have I seen this, right?
Right. And my lifetime is very, very small, like 30 years, and I'm going, what are the banks doing? Come on.
Right. So I've been watching, and of course I've been in finance. My whole career has been in finance. So I've been watching this since the 60s. Over and over and over again. It's called moral hazard, is what they call it in economics. That by bailing out these companies repeatedly, industries just come to learn that there's no consequence for failure, right? Because whatever happens, don't worry, their government's going to step in and take care of it. And the government has many very good reasons for why they did the things they did. And, it was for national security, it was for, we couldn't let the pension plans fail. I mean, they always have some reason for it, but the reality is that the correction that Citadel was asking about, like how do we stop that from happening, is a very painful sort of answer. And it says that you've got to let one of them fail.
And see, and that's what's amazing is so with all of this, like I've been in the market for about 10 years on and off. I started with Forex and everything, but my husband is economics. He absolutely loves it, and he was bringing it to my attention with, the difference between Keynesian and Austrian economics. And that's where it's like I found that technically, and please correct me if I'm so wrong on this, but Austrian is, the Western world is mostly Austrian, but we're leaning more Keynesian. Is that what you're finding, or?
I think we've been Keynesian for a really long time.
Right.
So Keynes took over, and every time there's some financial disruption, governments all turn to Keynes and say, well, we just need to spend more government money. But this is a problem with any sort of activity, government activity, is that it's in government's best interest to be bigger, right? It's not necessarily in our best interest, economically, financially, or otherwise, but it's in government's best interest to always be bigger. And so government will always, when government is in control of spending, they will always want to spend more.
So, Dr. T, is it really the fact that we're talking about government and politics and power and capitalistic economies versus democratic type of economies? Is that why we're struggling so much?
Well, we're in a democratic capitalism, right? We have capitalist democracy is what we have. So did you mean like the difference between capitalists and socialists? Is that where you were?
That's what I'm sorry. I misspoke, but
you were, okay.
I was just saying that because of the way our current situation is kind of folding out, and we've seen this play, like it's the same movie with just different actors. That's all it is. It's the same movie. It's like you make, not to make fun of my favorite movie, Jurassic Park, you have different dinosaurs, but the same shit happens, right? Ultimately.
Right. And it becomes predictable, right? Penn Central Railroad, 1970, $3.2 billion. Lockheed, 1971, $1.4 billion. I mean, that's I'm looking at that table in the 2015 book. And you can get this lessons not learned, by the way, if you have access to any public library or college library with ebooks. This is in the ebooks. It's in the ProQuest. You could read it. You could read this online if you wanted. But so safety with accountability is something that we're supposed to have to make the financial systems work, right? And in our case, though, we have in the name of safety, our government does not hold accountable those firms and the individuals who drive the firms, into this danger, and then, the firms themselves. So the difference between socialism and capitalism. So I personally believe that Ronald Reagan was a massive socialist, right? And that's a bit shocking, isn't it? Because he was supposed to be on the side of big business and capitalism, but his version, and that's kind of as far back as I can say that I've actually sort of lived through it and studied it and looked at it, although I'm sure it's been around a lot longer. Anytime the government gets involved in the economy, that's leaning in that direction, right? So there are firms and politicians who say, oh, everything should be capitalist and, survival of the fittest, whatever. But when they need a bailout, where do they go? When they get into financial trouble, where do they go? They go to the government. They swear they're capitalists. They swear that they're, conservative, financially conservative, they're in the political spectrum. But the reality is that they turn to the government for money.
So can I ask you, this wasn't on the paper, and I understand if you don't want to answer it.
No, it's okay.
But speaking of debts and government bailouts and everything, and I've been watching the debt ceiling vote, like them having to figure out our debt ceiling as a nation and the possibility of them not voting on it. Like I saw something with McConnell saying like, nope, we're not voting on this, sorry. And it's due by July 31st. Is there anything that you can kind of guess on like what's going on with that, like the impact to the economy that could have?
No, I'm sorry, start that off again. You said what's coming up July 31?
They're supposed to have a vote on our national debt ceiling.
Oh, that thing, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I didn't know if you knew much about like what kind of impact that could have, or if you think they'll actually, final minute.
They'll pass it.
You
They'll
think so?
pass it.
Good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just don't see any scenario under which the government. So in order to say we cannot increase the debt any further, they would have to cut spending, or at least not increase spending beyond what they already have. That would freeze their whole budget at that point. Chances that they're going to do that, like, yeah, Citadel, what were you saying?
And then ultimately, years past, this led to a government, a shutdown or furlough that became a political battle of wits versus, actual, economics, if I recall.
Right, they'll use it for they use it for leverage. So infrastructure is another thing that's coming up for a vote. And I did a lot of research in 2009, 2011, 2012, around there on the transportation infrastructure and what it would take to fix it. Like you need $1 trillion just to fix the airports in New York. That's $1 trillion.
Gosh.
Because they have outgrown space and time. They either have to start opening new regional airports and funneling traffic away from the 3 main New York metro airports, or they need, and even to do that or anything else, they need like $1 trillion just to fix that. So when you hear where they said it was like, however many trillion it is, it's over 10 years. So it comes up to about $500 billion a year. That's not going to fix anything, right? So, but what happens is by not voting to increase the debt ceiling, they were able to then attach something to that bill. They use it as leverage and say, well, right? So they say, I'm going to vote no unless you add, like 200 miles of border wall in Texas, right? Unless you add, like we didn't get 1 year, we didn't get our transportation funding was held up, not passed because they wanted to put an anti-abortion clause in there. And of course you can't, like if you vote for the transportation funding, then you're voting to, limit choice. I mean, it's just like they'll stick something very hyper political in there, like one of these, what do they call them, the dog whistle, right? Hot button issues. They'll attach something like that, which they would not work. They don't have the courage to just propose that bill up front and say, here's a bill that says nothing more than add, 400 miles of border wall across the Rio Grande River in Texas. So instead, they want to slip it into something that we need, which is, right, transportation infrastructure funding. We need that debt ceiling has to come up. There are ways around the debt ceiling. So between the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, they can restructure some of the debt in different ways so that they can actually keep increasing the amount of money that flows in and out without technically passing that debt ceiling. So there are ways around it. It's in my lifetime that has come up repeatedly. Government shutdowns, just comes up over and over again. We really do need to do something about it. We can't go on spending like drunken sailors.
Oh gosh, no.
So but government funding is like a lot of other things. It's feast and famine, right? 7 years of feast and 7 years of famine. And during the 7 years of plenty, you store away some of that, right? So that when the famine comes up, you have something in reserve. So the last time the federal government paid down the national debt was in the last years of the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton's second shot. he actually started paying down the national debt because there was enough money coming in that they not only didn't have to borrow more, they could actually start paying it down. But every time we have some surge in the economy, the politicians just look at it and say, hey, let's spend some more money.
Oh, and it's so funny you say that too, because I was watching one of the congressional pitches basically to get money, and they were talking about there was someone asking for a substantial amount to study if quails are more sexually active if under meth. Did you see that or something? It was I was like, why are we studying this? Like, there's no. Oh goodness. So
there are whole organizations dedicated, like ProPublica is one of them. There are several of them out there who just look at waste in government. And you're right. But here's the thing. And I don't know if have the most up-to-date information on this, but the last time I looked at it, we had not passed a new budget for the federal government since about 1996. Okay. Instead, we do these continuing resolutions, which simply says we'll spend in the same proportion of everything that we spent last year. We'll just raise it all by 3%. Right. That's a continuing resolution. So in other words, the structure of spending hasn't been updated in 20 years. And if you think back to 20 years ago, how many people were look at the structure of your household spending from let's say from pre-2000 to today. Pre-2000, you may have had one computer, but you didn't have so much high-speed internet. You may or may not have had a cell phone. Think of all of the things that you spend money on now that your household didn't spend on 20 years ago. And that's what the federal government's working with. So until they update, like if they did an actual budget, like start to finish new budget, they could get rid of some of this, studying fruit flies or whatever. I mean, some of that could be cut out. And a lot of that just turns out being what they call pork barrel spending, where you want to spend, in order to get reelected in your district, you have to get some spending that they want, right? That your voters want. And if your voters want you to study, crawdads in Louisiana, then you try to get money to study crawdads in Louisiana. That's the way that works. But we do digress from the question that Citadel asked. And this is all sort of tied together, right? Because if you want, the SEC and the Department of Treasury and the Federal Reserve Bank to be looking out for the best interest of investors, the Federal Reserve Bank is apolitical. It's a political appointment, but they try to stay away from what politicians want and do really what they think is best for the economy. But the SEC is a political organization. FINRA is a self-regulatory organization. As long as that's going on, then these problems will occur where, the fox is in charge of the hen house. So the transparency is one way that market transparency is something that all of those organizations should strive for, and that should allow you to protect yourself when they're not protecting you, right? So some of the information
I'm sorry. I think the operative word was should, and it circles back to underscore the moral hazard aspect. I'm sorry to interrupt.
You're absolutely right. There's things that they should do, but the moral hazard has been there for such a long time. It's so deeply embedded. Yeah. And what was the next part of that question? Because I know we digressed into the whole government thing there for a minute.
My apologies.
No, it was, the subsequent question had to do with, it still falls under transparency, but do you believe short positions, should be publicly, reported publicly? Because right now available data is, not complete.
Right. So it's the same thing with the fails. They give you the list of the victims, but not the perpetrators. Right. So how are you to protect yourself as an investor if they won't tell you who is perpetrating these frauds upon the market? right? Like the short sells and the naked short sells and fails to deliver. So for both of those, all that we're getting is which companies were shorted and by how much, which companies' shares were not delivered and by how much, but not who did it. And so, but I will say, I do have to say this, it's not good information. It's fairly useless information, but at least we have that, where in a lot of countries, they don't even have that much. So trying to find out fails to deliver in Europe or even in the UK, really hard to do. Canada, it's impossible. But just to get that much information about fails, for example, you know, it took probably a solid 5 to 8 years of banging on every door for every company, every lawyer, SEC. Everybody called their senators, their, you know, congressmen, and, you know, really banged on the door of government to try to get something done about it, just to get that much. And it's still not good. All it does is continues to shove it in our face to say, yeah, it's still a problem. It doesn't say, here's how to fix it. It just says, here's still a problem.
So Dr. T, just adding on to that, can we trust data that's being reported? Because FTDs don't seem to make any sense. The correlations, the points we're looking at for data integrity don't really make sense to us. People that are, you know, we've spent months on this, at least 7, 8 months, all of us, at least together here.
Can you trust it? You can trust that it is I would not be, I'm not worried that it isn't what they say it is, right? I'm worried that what they say it is isn't enough. I want more than they're showing me. So for example, the FTD report that you're getting from the Securities and Exchange Commission are the fails to deliver on that day, right? On that settlement date, released to you 2 weeks or 4 weeks later. I think it's 4 weeks now. It's not yesterday. You know, they take their time.
Right.
The number of shares and the closing price on settlement date, not on trade date, which again is useless to me, but on settlement date for shares that were not delivered to the National Securities Clearing Corporation, period. It has nothing else is in there. No broker to broker, no off market, no OTC, no internal broker, nothing, just what's there, right?
But
so
even the NSCC is a self-governing body themselves. So my point, my question back again is, data cannot be trusted completely because the governing bodies that are supposed to be implementing and guiding and supposed to be technically governing, right? Even they're sort of in a lingo situation or non-trustworthy. So what do we like? Where is our sense of security, or where's our sense of feeling like we can trust it?
Right. So I would have no doubt that the number that they give to the SEC is the number that came out of their computer. I don't think that it wouldn't seem to me that there's anyone there who's actually going to take the time to change the number that's there. The problem is that there are so many things that can be done before that number. So the users at NSCC can do things that then alter, have an impact on that number. So that's where that number gets changed, not because NSCC is an SRO, because they're self-regulated. That's not why I wouldn't trust that number. I wouldn't trust that number because it's only there's just too many ways for the broker members to game those numbers, right? Put in offsetting trades, none of which is allowed. I mean, if they get caught, they're in trouble. But what does trouble mean? We just talked about that. Slap on the wrist, you can come back tomorrow and play again. But there are a lot of things they can do to game that. So that's why I wouldn't trust them. The fact that they're an SRO is why they allow FILs to exist at all, right? And why do FILs exist in the first place? Because they're self-regulated.
Exactly. And sort of like, it's not even just the NSCC, it's the other folks like the OCC, the DTCC, everything is self-governing. FINRA, for example, the numbers that we're trying to validate against as far as integrity, nothing makes sense. Nothing is connecting. So we're going in circles trying to trust some data that supposedly we think is correct, but then even the market makers at some point have their own ways of fact checking the data or doing whatever they have to. When your options get routed through certain payment for order flow workflows, everything is sort of all over the place. So where do we go to trust the data? What's a good place for the regular ape or retail investor to go get data to ensure that we are looking at the right data?
So let me toss this question back to you. What are you looking for that data to show you?
The data is for us to feel, us in the sense, all of the retail investors to validate that, there is a manipulated market happening. There is an unfair situation we've been put in. And we just want to make enough noise as a collective to show whoever is supposedly on our side, like the government entities, that we see a unfair situation and we need help. We're making all the noise we can at this point, right? Ultimately, and at least at the minimum, we're doing that's our hope.
Right. So I don't think that's, I'm not sure how useful that is, because that information is fragmented. So there's a set of books that the broker has that is internal to each of them that they don't even show each other, that says how many shares they bought that day and how many they actually got that day. Bought and got, right? So they buy 1 million shares for their customers and they only get 500,000. Then there's 500,000 that they know of, right, that they can't give to their customers. And they're not even telling you that those aren't there. So I'm not sure that it's worth your effort to try to nail down to the number exactly how many shares are where or what. A company can do that. I think we talked about that last time. There is a way for a company to find that out exactly. As an investor, you can't, but as long as the FTD data is not zero, as long as the short sales are not zero, as long as the stock lending is not zero, you know that some one of you or more, some percentage of you have broker accounts with nothing in them, have broker statements that are in fact untrue. You know that for a fact. And shouldn't that be enough for you to go to whatever regulator you want to talk to and say, hey, this has to be taken care of. This has to be looked at.
I definitely agree. And so, Dr. Trimbath, I was actually wondering, I've brought this up a few times. Do you think there would be a way that the, Wall Street or the stock exchange would ever implement a new way of doing things? So like my thought process was using, blockchain or like NFTs, because those are becoming a thing, just to kind of help try to regulate the market a little bit more, because we know with crypto, every coin has its own individual address and you can see exactly which wallets it's been into. Do you think that would ever be a possibility, or kind of old ways and that's the only way it's going to be?
So I get this question a lot.
Oh,
We hear this a lot. Everybody's like, if you just did this, if you just did that.
mm-hmm.
Those are not solutions.
No.
When companies first issued shares, they printed a certificate with a number on it.
Right.
And they handed it to you, the investor, and you could take that certificate to anywhere in the world, and people would know that you in fact own 100 shares of IBM. They were registered in your name.
Right.
And there were problems with that, slowdowns, whatever. But the reality is that certificate, those shares in fact could be traced from buyer to seller all the way back to original issue, just by looking at the records of the transfer agent registrar. That role of a transfer agent registrar still exists today. So your problem is not in the form of share ownership. your problem is not in the form of the ownership that you have in that company. It's the rest of the stuff.
All right.
So if let's say you did this non-fungible token, and this has all been tried before, that, we want to do an NFT. What if we did a crypto dividend or an NFT dividend? Or people tried doing, like, we're going to give out silver dollars, right? Physical silver dollars as a dividend. You have to be a share owner to get it. It won't go to nominees. It's just that the people who have set up the gaming part of this have been at it for so long that, trust me, if you're thinking about NFTs and crypto, so are they.
Right.
And they're thinking about, how can I keep doing what I'm doing in that environment? But the reality is that I don't think you need that, because that you could go today, if you wanted shares of GME, for example, you could go to GME and buy those shares through their agent, and you would have, your name would be on the books, and there is no one who could lend your share or negate your share or do anything else to it, because GME has hired someone to make sure that only the number of shares that they have authorized are in fact in existence on those records. It's the broker's records and the depository's records. Those are the records you have to worry about.
Fair enough. I appreciate that. I appreciate that a bunch.
It sounds like, it was the advent of high frequency trading that kind of caused this, was the catalyst to this. So it sounds like we're having an audit trail problem. Before it was easily, one could trace point A to B, C. Now we have no efficient audit trail, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, it's that it's become opaque, right? So
Right.
there's a lack of transparency in that trail now.
Understood.
Yeah. So if you think about where are these problems occurring, what was it Indian asked about how can I, like, what's the goal of all this data mining, this data searching people are doing? Well, can I trust the data? Is the data good? Like, what's the purpose of getting all that data? Well, I want to know, like, how many shorts and how many this and how many the other thing. If it's not zero, if the fails aren't zero, then you know that there's a problem. How big is that problem? It's still a problem.
That's true. And that's the ultimate goal, I think, and perfectly said, Dr. T. I think that's our intention, right? As retail investors, as people who are in the game, now have skin in the game, who've gotten into investing. A lot of us this year, since COVID at least has hit, we want to be more educated. We're trying to educate ourselves. This Discord, what we're doing here is to bring upon financial literacy, trading, how to do basic options play, multitude of different classes about the economics, all of that. And that's why I think for me personally, I'm a data guy. We're in a data revolution right now. Tech revolution, agriculture, all of that. We're in the data revolution. Right now, data is key. So my hope in asking you the questions that I did was not to get heated or passionate, but my passion just comes out as I also truly want to know, for all of us, the regular retail investors, the data that's out there. There's so much data out there. What is the ultimate goal of all this data? Asking, like, what's the point of all of this? Because ultimately, we're still holding. Nothing is happening. There hasn't been a short squeeze that we're expecting it to be on some of the favorite stocks we're looking at. But ultimately, it's not just about the short squeeze. It's about actually educating ourselves as to why this data continues to be there for years. There is apparently a warehouse of failure to deliver that's available, but nobody knows where it is and how much information is in there. And
somebody knows where.
Right, exactly, somebody, but
that's not public, right? So that's like, did American Airlines advertise where they stored all those planes that they didn't use in 2020? It's that kind of thing. Like, somebody knows, but it's not information available to you. So, but I think, like, to your point, exactly, data, I'm a data hound myself. I've never met a number I didn't like. So I can do lots of things with numbers because I've got all this advanced mathematics. But the thing is, like, which data are you looking at? So that So there's company level data that should be more important to you as an investor than the market level stuff. The market level stuff is for day traders, for people who, if you're particularly interested in, trying to do something about FTDs, recognizing the problems that stock lending and short selling, the impact that has on your portfolio. There are lots of groups who are activists in that. Most of them are companies, right? Companies and the transfer agents are the two parties who are most interested in seeing all of that stopped, because they're kind of the front line, right? They see it, they're directly impacted by it. But yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with looking at a lot of data, but you just have to look at what's the source of the data and what does this data say it is. So for example, like I said, with the SEC fails data, that's only what failed at DTC. That's not what failed at, in Canada depository or in Europe or in South Korea or wherever else. None of that is in there, right? That only has what failed at that one place. Knowing that, you would then recognize that there's no way to connect that with the short data that comes from NYSE. It's apples and oranges.
Right. No, that's perfect. I think that's the intent is to, I think it's the transparency aspect of it is what we're trying to do here is be as transparent as possible. And and given that, I just want to quickly pivot as we're at a little past an hour now, quickly on the price manipulation that we kind of see and how the media affects all of us. A lot of news outlets, especially ones that are available online for free, have been giving advice in certain regards to certain securities, like Benzing, for example, puts out an article. Do you believe there should be any regulation in regards to what can be stated in general on certain securities, or is it all controlled by market makers or people who have the ability, like we discussed earlier, right? The politics and the power and the money to really show us what's out there? Because a part two of this question kind of goes along with, like, we're fighting against not people, Dr. T, we're fighting against algos, computers mostly. So where's sort of the crux, right? Like, how much of it is malicious and how much of it is like truthful that we're able to see?
So when I want to look at stock recommendations, stock prices, things like that, I go to things like I don't know if they're even still in business, called the Dow Theory Forecast, and they would just give you like all of the fundamentals for the company, for its industry, and for the market. And then and then a recommendation to buy, sell with some predictions of where they think that the finances are going to go. The companies themselves are not permitted, publicly listed companies are not permitted to make forward-looking statements, right? You see that disclaimer is always there. All of those online programs, TV programs, whatever, they all have that disclaimer that says, this is not financial advice, or, Jim Cramer says, this is for entertainment purposes only. I can't tell you how many Twitter followers, when I look at their profile, it says, not financial advice, so I think that disclaimer is there for what you're saying, like that is already regulated, that you're not allowed to say, companies aren't allowed to make forward-looking statements. That's how Elon Musk keeps getting into trouble for tweeting some, future he has in mind for his company. There are rules about who can be. You have to be a registered. You have to be registered as a financial advisor to be able to give people financial advice. Like, there's already plenty of rules out there, but everybody just gets away by putting a disclaimer on it and says, you're on your own. So the reality is that you are in fact on your own. And this comes up all the time with students, right? When they're trying to do a writing assignment, where like they'll just throw some HTTP www URL up there and say, okay, this is my source. And I have to constantly send them back to looking at, like, how do you tell how do you define this source that you're looking at? So if it's, on television or whatever, newspapers, things like this, like they have an about page. That's the first thing you do is you go look for that about us page. And if there isn't an about us page on whatever you're looking at, that's a red flag, right? Right away, that tells you that there's something hinky about it. I always tell students to look at, GOV and EDU are two really good domains, because they're either, in a college, university, or some government thing where you're going to at least get, that they're somewhat more regulated. There's a thing called Tips for Analyzing Sources. At their library guides are available at pretty much all of the community colleges, have them on their websites. You don't have to be a student, just go to whatever your local one is, look for, library guides, fact checking, how do I analyze sources, and they'll have a whole list of things that you do and don't, right? So there are ways to decode Twitter handles, right? Too many numbers, bad spelling, bad grammar, right? Links that have IO at the end instead of something real. So you have to use all of that thinking right up ahead. But the biggest problem is paid content, right? So Wall Street Journal wouldn't have a reason to exist if you don't invest in the stock market. So it's in their best interest to keep you interested in the stock market, which means they don't want to say good things about, I don't know, real estate or, some other types of investments. Same thing with CNBC. Fox Business News, I guess. Some of those tend to be more just general business and not just financial, but you want to pay attention to that, because paid content, sponsored content, if you see the same headline on multiple websites, then somebody is probably paid to get that spread out, right? That's not original content. So you want to be able to do that for you. I'll give you a good example. So I went to this dentist in LA, and I saw a picture. They had a picture of Cher, autographed picture from Cher in the lobby, and an autographed picture from Lee Iacocca, both of them saying something nice about the dentist. Now, I don't take political or financial advice from Cher, but I would definitely take her advice as to whether or not this doctor was paying free, right? On the other hand, Lee Iacocca, I would take his advice for finance and business, but I'm not sure I would take his advice as to whether or not he thinks this dentist is painless. So when I see a source, I want to make that evaluation. And if you're doing that, then there's already plenty of rules out there about what can and can't be said. The problem is that it's always that, speed reading exercise at the bottom of the commercial, that very fine print that you didn't bother to read, the thing that you clicked and said, yes, I agree. Like, all the details are in there about whether or not you should have trusted that source. And with that, I do have to say, I have another call at 3:00. So if we could if you want to ask something for clarification, otherwise I'm going to have to stop at this point.
I believe Lady had something for you. I just wanted to say thank you for clarifying that, because I have to keep telling everybody to stop using Wikipedia for sources. I appreciate you going into that.
I will say Wikipedia is much better now than it was 10 years ago. Even. So, yeah.
Well, I guess, you really touched upon it. We don't have to go really diving deep into it, but I didn't know if you were aware today, the #1 trending hashtag is dark pool abuse in the United States. And I guess I'm just curious your thoughts on it. Do you really believe that with the amount of information that we are receiving, that we truly have a fair market as it currently stands?
I would say there's no such thing as a free market. If you go into the library of any law office that deals in securities law, you will find shelf after shelf after shelf of rules, regulations, case law. I mean, that it's really not, it's really not a free market in any sense. And the people who, want it to be, sort of freer are often the ones who are first in line when it comes to getting protection from the government, to getting more rules passed. It's not, in my view, it's not that we need more rules, it's that we need to actually enforce some of the rules we already have, because enforcement has been just an enormous problem throughout, throughout my lifetime, at least, in the financial markets, global financial markets. Dark pools are exactly what they say they are. They are dark, meaning you cannot see what's going on in there. And so whether they're being abused or not is not something you can know. What you can know is, like Indian said, I see something that doesn't make sense. In my experience, if I'm knowledgeable in this field and I'm looking at data or events or news or whatever it is, and it doesn't make sense to me, chances are that's because someone is working very hard to hide what's actually going on. Someone has the intention of deceiving the people who are looking at this. So how do you ferret that out? The only way that I know of is to actually find sort of whistleblowers on the inside to come out and talk about it. Other than that, I don't think that there is a way to know.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Trimbath, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And we do have a couple questions that a couple of our members have put together. And hopefully, maybe I'll reach out to you soon and kind of see if maybe you're willing to kind of address some of our members' questions in the future.
Yeah, let's put a pin in that and see what we can do, and maybe do another round. No, we'll see. Let's see how it goes.
I would absolutely love that. I love listening to you, so I would fangirl all over it again. I've just been smiling this whole time, so.
Thanks so much for that. Yeah, thanks. And I do like to keep it at an hour. I think it's hard for people to continue to absorb new information after that period of time. When I teach classes, I always try to take a break somewhere around there. So
that works for us too. Sorry we kept you a little bit longer today. That I will totally take blame for that. I apologize.
Thank you again so much, Dr. Trimbath.
Thank you, Dr.
You're welcome, lady.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Citadel. All right, you guys have a great evening.
You too.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, guys, on YouTube, we are going to call it for that. I hope you guys all enjoyed it as much as I did. And we will have probably a follow-up podcast where we can include our Discord members and everybody that wants to talk about it and kind of get your guys' thoughts and feelings on what you heard. That'll be tomorrow, our Friday night, 10 o'clock podcast. So yeah, I hope to see you guys there.
10 p.m. Eastern. Don't forget it's Eastern. Sorry.
Yeah, Eastern. Sorry. That's the only time zone that exists apparently in my head, is that, so yeah, does anybody, Indian, Citadel, Lady, anyone have anything else to add before we go?
No, thank you everyone for joining us. We appreciate it, and we hopefully, fingers crossed, are going to be able to speak with her again.
Indeed, I never thought I would hear her say, "Thank you, Citadel." So that'll be a good soundbite to save.
Oh no.